Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to take a look at the United Nations Human Development Report for 2016. It's an extremely interesting book that will apply to all 7.6 billion people on our planet. My guest today is an expert on this project. My guest today is Mr. Selim Jahan. Mr. Selim Jahan, a Bangladeshi national, is the director of the United Nations Development Program's Human Development Report Office in New York. Before joining UNDP in 1992, Mr. Jahan held several positions, one including as a professor of economics and director of the Economic Research Unit at the University of Dhaka in Bangladesh. Selim Jahan, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you very much. It's good to be back.
Yes, it is, right, where you have such timely products. And this one looks, as with all the others, is very, very timely. And this is your Human Development Report for 2016. Correct. And we're going to be talking about this and get into it. Before we do that, though, tell me a little bit about the United Nations Development Program, UNDP. That's one of those acronyms that you see quite a bit of, both within the UN system and also outside. What is the mission of UNDP?
I think the mission of UNDP actually is to enhance human development all around the world through poverty reduction, basically helping democratic governance issues, dealing with climate change and sustainability, and at the end to build capacities within the countries so the countries can really own their priorities and move forward the development process.
Now you head up the Human Development Report Office within the United Nations Development Program. What is the Report Office?
The Report Office is actually a unit within UNDP which produces its annual flagship publication, the Human Development Report. But the office enjoys editorial independence, which was given to us by UN General Assembly. So it's part of UNDP, and we produce this report, which is a report to UNDP, but not necessarily of UNDP.
And let's put out your email address, or your website, I'm sorry, is www.hdr.undp.org, and we'll put it in the lower thirds because that's a lot to write down. This is a very interesting report, but we're talking about human development. I guess all of us, everybody who's watching this show right now would probably have their own definition of human development. How do you define it? Is there a macro, broad definition for that?
Well, we always say that the human development is about the richness of human lives and not necessarily the richness of economies, by which we mean that human development is about enlarging human choices, giving them more opportunities, enhancing human freedom and human rights. That's all about human development, actually.
And now your topic this year is the United Nations Development Program's Human Development Report 2016, Human Development for Everyone. How did you pick that topic, and what does that mean? Does that mean we're going to include all 7.6 billion people?
Ultimately, that's the one objective that we try to pursue, and that's the objective that also come out very strongly in the 2030 Development Agenda on Sustainable Development, when it says no one left behind. We picked up this topic because if you look at the past 25 years and the movement of human development all around the world, you will see that on average we have made tremendous progress on many fronts of human development. But at the same time, there are certain groups, there are certain countries, there are certain societies who have been left behind. So if we really want to have universal human development and also ensure that no one is left behind in the journey to human development, then the focus should be on human development for everyone, because every life counts and every human life is equally valuable.
Quite true. And how do you, when you talk about the situation where we're going to include everyone, include all 7.6 billion people in this particular progress, and you're talking about the progress we've made in the last 25 years, what are some of the major accomplishments you think we've achieved?
I think there are certain areas where the progress has been phenomenal. I mean, just look at extreme poverty. Every day, 250,000 people are escaping poverty all around the world. We also know that the child mortality has been halved. We know that 2.6 billion people now have access to safe water. These are broader achievements that the globe has made. At the same time, if you look at the regions, you will see that even sub-Saharan Africa is making quite a good progress on many fronts of human development. It has increased its life expectancy by 6 years during the last 10 years. So that's quite an achievement.
And a lot of this is due to economic development in those areas, but a lot of it too, I think, might be directly attributable to the United Nations having the Millennium Development Goal program that ran from 2000 to 2015 to focus on reducing abject poverty by 50%, to empower women, to provide universal primary school education. And the UN mobilized literally tens of thousands of institutions around the world, private sector, governments, and just on across the board. Service clubs such as Rotary International, Lions International, they really helped contribute to this, did they not?
Yeah, of course they did. I mean, development today is a complex challenge, and you cannot leave it to only one actor, the state. And economic growth has been a necessary condition for improving the lives of people around the world, but it's not a sufficient condition. Because of the work of the UN, its convening power, at the same time by bringing in the private sector, the NGOs, the foundations, all hands were on deck basically to mobilize resources, to provide basic social services to people who need it, to send children to school, to provide basic medical services to people. So I think it's a combination of collective efforts all around the world which made those accomplishments, which I have referred to a few minutes ago, possible on a global scale. Yes.
Now we're talking about some of the accomplishments. What are some of the areas where we really need to take another look at, maybe mobilize some more resources to help deal with these problem areas?
Yes, I think that's a very important question, Bill, because even though we have made lots of progress, there are also deprivations, we know. We know that 795 million people are still hungry. Inequality is on the rise. 8 billionaires in the world own as much wealth as the bottom 50% of the globe, which means that each billionaire is about 462 million people's worth. So inequality is a major issue that we have to deal with it. At the same time, as the report has pointed out, that there are different groups which have been left out in this journey of human development. And there are significant barriers to them, barriers in terms of access to services, barriers in terms of productive resources, barriers in terms of taking part in the things that shape their lives. So those are some of the challenges. Some of them are quantitative, some of them relate to participation, some of them relate to their rights, and those are the challenges that the world will have to look at as we move forward. And then there is the whole issue of conflict, issue of climate change, which are very much needed for making development sustainable.
You mentioned income inequality. Years ago, we used to look at the economically developing countries. Let's say, look at Latin America, look at the huge chasm between the haves and the have-nots. Today, that has changed quite dramatically. Today, we can look at the United States, and we can look at some of the developed countries, economically developed countries, and have even wider chasms. And how can we focus on this without totally upsetting the economic system, but also by the same token to make it more equitable, more fair, and more just for the people who participate in the economy and who really create the economy to a large degree?
I think there are three ways of dealing with it. One way is that you have to provide equal opportunities to them. I mean, even if you look at the developed world, in many cases there are inequalities and unequal access of people to education, to health services, and that kind of thing. So that playing field needs to be what we call more or less on equal front. Then there is also the whole issue of the productive resources and how people participate in production. And the whole question of productivity and wages are very important. We have people in the economy of the developed countries who are getting salaries and the benefits which no way can rationalize the kind of the contribution they make to the economy. And finally, the policies. I think the whole taxation policy, the whole question of how you are trying to mobilize resources from different groups of people, how the incidence and the impacts of those taxes are on different groups of people have to be looked at. So it's a question of bringing in the policies in a way where we can really make it happen.
Now, earlier I mentioned the Millennium Development Goals. We're on track from 2000 to 2015, a 15-year program. And of course, they more or less expired in December 31st of 2015. Then the Sustainable Development Goals are now in play from 2016 through 2030. What are the Sustainable Development Goals? Not all 17 of them, but the concept of Sustainable Development Goals, and why are they important for everyone, all 7.6 billion people?
Right. I think the way I put it, that Millennium Development Goals, that made a great change in the world. There's no doubt about it. But the basic focus was us and them, because they focused on mostly extreme poverty and more relevant to poor countries, not necessarily middle income countries and not necessarily developed countries. But when you talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, you didn't lose those basic focus, but you also have brought in added dimensions, like, for example, climate change, like sustainability, like inequality, and all kinds of things. So the Sustainable Development Goals are basically for all of us. So that's the basic difference, I guess. They are important because they are basically looking at 5 things: the planet, the balance between planet and people. They are looking at peace. They are looking at partnership. They are looking at participation. So those 5 P's, I think, are very much important to have a development journey and a development path, which would not only ensure opportunities for the present generation, but will also ensure opportunities for our future generations.
And it's so important that even though the Millennium Development Goals only focused on the economically developing countries, that today all countries, all 193 nations of the United Nations are included in this, and they all have a role to play in helping to achieve these. You've mentioned now, I think I've tried to count 2 or 3 times climate change. That, according to the scientists, many scientists, and to a large number of people, believe that that's the #1 challenge we're confronting today. How does climate change factor into what you're doing with this Human Development Report, and what role is it going to play to determine how well we accomplish these goals in the future?
I think the first part of the question, the climate change has come into the report in a big way. First of all, we have looked at climate change not only as an environmental issue, but as a development concern. Because if you have climate change, that is going to affect your agriculture, the livelihood of farmers, the food security, and the list continues. So we made that point very clear, that climate change is an integral part of ensuring human development. The second point is we have brought in different kinds of data into the report. For example, if we don't take action right now about climate change, there will be an additional 100 million people who would be thrown into extreme poverty by 2030, and that's alarming. And the third thing that we talked about the climate change is actually to make that point very clear, that in today's world, if development is not resilient, it's not sustainable. And the resilience of development in our world would also come how we tackle climate change. So there are specific policies that we have talked about in the report to deal with the climate change. Your final question, or the second part, if the climate change is not addressed properly, I have already alluded to what is going to happen to extreme poverty. That's only part of the problem. There will be more, for example, diseases that will come. There will be more development concerns in terms of the livelihood of people. There will be more disasters, as we have been observing in different parts of the world. And all of these things will impact human development in the ultimate analysis.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with any type of media outlet, be it a PBS station, community access television station, or you just happen to be involved with a university that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you just have a website and you'd like to share our programs, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided free of charge as a public service to help people better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today we're taking a look at a very important report, the Human Development Report for 2016, and talking about how it is hoping to include all 7.6 billion people in the world. My guest today is an expert on this report. My guest today is Mr. Selim Jahan. Mr. Selim Jahan currently is the director of the Human Development Report Office through the United Nations Development Program. Selim, we're talking about this very interesting report, and I'll hold it up here one more time, just in case somebody joined us a little late in the program. But we're talking about this very interesting report on climate change. You were talking about the millions, hundreds of millions would be dispossessed because the climate is changing, the glaciers are melting, the seas are rising, desertification is taking place. Agricultural output is being adversely affected in many areas of the world. Are we starting to see more and more of the climate change refugees? There are 65 million refugees that the UN High Commission for Refugees is working with this year, along with other organizations. But are we going to see more and more climate change refugees?
I think we will, because what happens is that there's a link between climate change and poverty. It is the poor people who are more affected by climate change. And whenever there is an environmental degradation, you have referred to some of them, desertification, deforestation, it's the poor people who actually move to more and more marginalized land. At this point in time, 2 billion people live on land which is ecologically fragile. So therefore, I think with climate change and with the advent of, for example, environmental degradation, the poverty will be rising. At the same time, inequalities will also be rising. And the impact would be at several levels. At an individual level, the whole question of livelihood would be at danger. At the societal and at the national level, there will be more and more people who would be either internally displaced or they will be externally displaced, because people will have to look for opportunities. So they will try to move from one place to another within a particular country, or they will try to cross borders. So when you talk about the refugees, some of the refugees are because of conflict, we all know. Some of the refugees are because of other reasons, for example, economic aspirations. But some of the refugees are definitely environmental refugees, no doubt about that.
Now, we were talking before how everybody has a role to play. There are many major players, major actors. The UN can do so much. It has UN agencies that can help work on these problems. Governments can do so much. The private sector can do so much. But a lot of it has to come at the national level in each of these countries. Do you have a strategy to involve the national folks in this type of activity to help mobilize resources and to focus their resources on these problems?
We did. I think in the report we talked about the kind of the responsibilities and role of national authorities or governments, but also the international organizations. The second thing we try to highlight is that resources is only one factor of that. The other factors are policies, the institutions, the whole question of transparency, accountability, the rule of law. Some of those things are important. Now, at the national level, we talked about four-pronged policies. One is universal policies, where we talk about the whole question of inclusive growth, financial inclusion, investing in girls and women, which is the smartest investment that a country can make. The second, we also talked about the whole question of looking after those who are disadvantaged. For example, persons with disabilities, 1 billion of them. At the same time, indigenous peoples which suffer many kinds of discrimination, women and girls, they need to have specific targeted intervention in order to improve their lot. Third, we also talked about that development has to be resilience at the end of the day. If development is not resilience, it will not be sustainable. And finally, we talked about voice and autonomy in terms of empowering people, that they can have a voice in determining what they want, how they want to lead their life, how to shape the things that has an impact on their lives. At the same time, we live in a global world, and in the global world, countries are they have interactions with each other. So therefore, the global institutions are important. And we suggested in the report, the global institutions that we have today are basically the global institutions which were formed after the Second World War. The world is different now. So therefore, I think we have to look at the representation of developing countries in global institutions, their governance structure, how those global institutions can actually facilitate the national initiatives in order to enhance human development.
Those are all very important points. The last one you mentioned about global institutions, if you think back to World War II, the United Nations came out of the rubble, the ashes of World War II, and dealt mostly with peace and security, economic and social development, and human rights. Those were the three major missions. they weren't talking about climate change.
Yeah.
They weren't talking about Ebola.
Yeah.
They weren't talking about some of the major
Absolutely.
problems we're
Absolutely.
confronting today.
Yeah. No, that's true, because development challenges change. Development landscape also change. We now talk about climate change, inequalities, Ebola, all kinds of things. And who knows, there may be other challenges as we move forward. The future of work is also changing. I mean, that was a topic for the 2015 Human Development Report. Some of the works will be vanishing, but some may be coming up. There is the whole issue of fourth industrial revolution, where there are increasing automation of production processes. This will have an impact on economies, not only in the developed world, but also in the developing world. So I think we should have a very flexible, agile kind of an approach to those issues, because we are trying to deal with what I call moving targets, and that's very important.
And you're right, there will be more issues coming up in the future. We can bank on that for sure. Before we get off this empowerment, though, the empowerment is very important. The empowerment of women, that's Sustainable Development Goal number 5, I believe it is. But how are there certain specific suggestions on how governments can help empower people, unions can help empower people, university or educational systems? Do you have specific recommendations in the book?
Yes, we have specific recommendations, and the first thing we have said that in order to empower people, the first requirement that you have to protect and also try to enhance the human rights of people, the rights of people in the first place, freedom for association, freedom of speech, and all other kinds of rights that we have talked about there. Second, we have talked about that people should have equal opportunities through, for example, investing in them in health services and education. Third, we have talked about that people should have the space, the political space, the space for participation in order to voice their concerns and autonomy. And that is very much facilitated today by the digital revolution that we are seeing. So people can actually interact with each other. I mean, we have talked about that. And we also have brought in such institutional issues as the rule of law, the whole issue of the transparency and the accountability. Because if you don't have a transparent and accountable system, you actually cannot ensure that people will be able to voice their concerns. And that is more needed for people who are disadvantaged, who are marginalized, and who are not in the mainstream of development.
Well, in the last 30 or 40 seconds we have left, what do you see as the major challenge, especially in your area, the work that you're doing to identify these issues and these problems and to offer suggestions? What is your major challenge as you move forward looking at the 2017 report?
I think the major challenge is to change the mindset. I think that's the greatest challenge in development. And what we have argued very strongly in the report, that advances are possible, changes do take place. We can build on what we have achieved, we can explore new possibilities, and we can also attain what once unattainable. So let us start a journey. Let us start a journey from challenges to opportunities, from poverty to prosperity, from despair to hope. And I think the challenge actually in that journey is to reach out for the people who are farthest behind. Because if we can reach those people who are farthest behind, then at the end of the day, when we reach our goal, then we'll see and we'll look back and find that no one has been left behind. I think that's the challenge.
And that is certainly a laudable goal, to leave no one left behind. And again, our viewers can go to your website at www.hdr.undp.org and get much more information about what we've been talking about today, and to actually see the report. They can download it or they can read it online, however they would like to do it. But again, it's a very timely report, it's a very interesting report, and it's one that is, we talked about earlier, it affects all 7.6 billion people on the planet, and we have to move forward together, or we're going to have people left behind, we're going to have stragglers, and these are folks who will have to be assisted in some way, shape, or form as we go down this road. So we may as well try to work together. And
absolutely.
This one, again, I think all your reports, I think you mentioned you have had 13 of them.
12 of them.
12
yes.
of them up to this point. And they've all been very interesting and all been very timely. And now you're going to be issuing the reports a little earlier, so within about 5 or 6 months we may be back talking about another report that just came off the presses. But Mr. Selim Jahan with the United Nations Development Program, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Bill, it has always been a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.